GOP. Stay with us. We'll be right back with Joel Skousen. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to Joel Skousen, an expert in preparedness, securing your home, finding a secure location. We sell his books at Infowars.com, of course. One of the articles I came across, and we were talking about what's happening in Venezuela and everything that brought this up, was this massive military exercise they did over the weekend. 500,000 soldiers in Venezuela. And they said, well, this is to show of force for the United States. Nobody believes that anywhere. This is a show of force for their citizens, but they've been showing force to their citizens for quite some time. Look at this article from DC Clothesline. Did you know Venezuela banned guns for private citizens only 4 years ago? Yes, I did. But here's one interesting thing from that article. Here's a quote about what they did for people who were prepping. They say this was about the same time when they outlawed the guns, spent $47 million in this bankrupt kleptocracy to create disarmament centers. You know, we talk about the gun-free zones being victim disarmament centers. No, these are literal disarmament centers that they set up, spent $47 million to confiscate people's weapons. It was about the same time the government declared prepping illegal, said those who were quote-unquote hoarding could be detained on criminal charges, and when the country instituted a fingerprint registry for purchasing groceries. There you go. And if you bought more than you were allotted, then they would come after you. This is why you need to prepare now for your family. Now, of course, we sell InfoWars Select Storable Food. We also have a sale right now on Nascent Iodine, 20% off Survival Shield X2, Nascent Iodine. Prepare for yourself now. Prepare for your family now, because all the stuff that we're seeing has happened in Venezuela are things that Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton want to have happen in this country. From their economic policies to their gun confiscation, you name it, it's on the way. This is endemic to socialism. So joining us again is Joel Skousen. We were just talking, Joel, about what's going on in Brazil, and I pointed out that one of the big exports from Venezuela has been their voting machines. Of course, there was a cry about voter fraud when the president of Brazil, who has just been impeached, when she was elected. She was way behind in the polls, 10% behind the polls. She was being booed in soccer stadiums with 60,000 people there. But all of a sudden, she wins the election with these electronic voting machines, and then they shut down exit polls, which they normally would take exit polls. Your comments?
Well, exit polls have always been the primary restriction on voter fraud, even electronically. They just don't dare change the ultimate result more than 10% of exit polls. And so when you're going to do that, you have to shut down exit polling. And that's what happened in last year's election. Even in the United States, you didn't find any exit polls. When they defeated Romney, I have estimated that they actually eliminated over 8 million votes to defeat Romney versus Obama. But they're obviously doing that in Venezuela and Brazil.
And of course, the interesting thing, Joel, is that when they do the exit polls, and they do the exit polls, they just don't report them in most cases. What they'll do is they'll tell us, well, if this demographic went for this particular, men went for this candidate, women went for that one, or they'll slice it in different ways, but they won't say in their exit polls how many people voted for candidate A, how many voted for candidate B, so you can compare it to the actual results that they're going with.
And that's why it was important that in 2012, when Romney was defeated, it was the first time in the United States that the state results were tallied at the federal level. In other words, there was no way for an individual state to see if their tally had been part of the 8 million votes that disappeared, unless all the states at one time requested an audit simultaneously. Wow.
And when we're looking at this voter fraud, I did a report on this after the Utah primary, because I saw Smartmatic had been brought in by the GOP there. They spent $80,000 to bring in this Venezuelan electronic voting machine company to tally their GOP primary. In some of the countries where Smartmatic had operated, they had shut down mysteriously and lost millions of votes, tens of millions. In one country, it was 24 million votes just disappeared. And that's the amazing thing. There is no audit trail. And with these electronic voting machines, they're taking something which ought to be very, very simple math. We need to have the ability to look at who the voters are, as well as the way this is tallied and transmitted, have a paper record. But with electronic voting, they take all of that away, don't they, Joel?
That's right. And making votes disappear, they traditionally, it's very easy to write a program that erases itself after it's implemented, that flips votes. And we saw that in the Texas primary with electronic voting, where, they took votes from Donald Trump to beef up for Ted Cruz and others. But making votes disappear is an even tougher thing if you don't have a paper audit of totals. And that's, I think, the massive fraud that went on at the federal level to defeat Romney.
Absolutely. We see it over and over again. And of course, we've seen news reports where people brought in some college hackers to put a little program into the voting machine to switch all the votes and then erase itself after the fact. That's exactly what can be done. Stay with us. We're going to be right back with Joel Skousen. We're going to talk about what's going on in Japan with the outrage over an American Marine arrested in connection with the death of a woman on Okinawa. Welcome back to the Alex Jones Show. I'm David Knight, and we're talking to Joel Skousen of... let's see, I've got what's your website, Joel?
WorldAffairsBrief.com.
Yes, WorldAffairsBrief.com. Thank you. It just slipped my mind there for a moment. We've been talking about what's going on in Venezuela and South America. We're going to move it to the Pacific now in just a moment. But before we leave the elections, I saw this interesting story on WND, and I wanted to mention this, Joel, because I have personal experience from friends in North Carolina where something like this similarly happened. They're saying hundreds of dead voters are casting ballots decades after dying in L.A. People voting from the grave in L.A. County. Hundreds of so-called dead voters in Los Angeles County alone. They said there were 215 votes from the grave. They say this one individual, John Sinker, passed away in 2003, yet records show he was able to vote in 2004, 2005, 2006, 2008, and 2010. And I had the same thing happen, Joel, in North Carolina. My brother-in-law, who still lives there, had a friend who went to vote. And in North Carolina, you do not have to show a photo ID. And, of course, efforts to say that we want to have some kind of a photo ID, like driver's license, have been attacked by the Democrats as being racist, as intimidating people. I don't know why they're not intimidated when they have to show ID for the millions of other things that they do in their everyday life. But when you go to vote in North Carolina, you just walk up and you give them a name and an address, and they look it up and they say, okay, here you are. And they don't verify who you are with a photo ID. Now, what happened with my brother-in-law's friend, he said, I went to vote. I gave him my name, and they said, you've already voted. And he said, they looked at it, and his mother was on the voting roll who had already died. And they said, she's already voted as well. So all they have to do is go through the phone book, and they can go in and rig these votes. And, of course, they've extended the voting periods on this. I mean, it is incredible the amount of fraud and the different places at which that fraud can be injected into our process, isn't it?
Well, actually, David, it's you can't really do this by going through the phone book. This has to be done with access to archives and records, and thus you have to have collusion with the local state administration. In LA, for example, it's controlled by the Democrats, and that's where you're getting this systematic voter fraud. I mean, this is not done easily, and when it's done on the scale that it's been done in LA, you know it's official or unofficially official.
And of course, we're seeing them saying, we don't even want to have people require that people have citizenship in order to vote. We've seen many jurisdictions where the Democrats have done that. I mean, it is so over the top, the fraud that we're seeing here. And when the Bernie Sanders people, the one thing I'll agree with them on in terms of this election is what's happening with the superdelegates. Hillary Clinton started out with 15% of the votes the delegates that she needed to win the nomination. And every time we look at these areas where Bernie Sanders beats her by 10 to 15%, she winds up getting the same number of delegates because they have 10 to 15% of the delegates are superdelegates. So he can still beat her in all these elections that are proportional on the Democrat side. He can beat her by 10 or 15%, and yet she still gets the same number of delegates because they've reserved that number as superdelegates.
And it's hurting her in the polls now. Yeah. I mean, for the first time, we're seeing Trump starting to approach getting even in the polls with Hillary Clinton, and that was unthinkable 3 months ago in terms of polling. But she is so unpopular with the Democrats, I don't think she's going to get the percentage of Bernie Sanders voters that they think they are.
You know, it is interesting to see this war erupting. Everybody was thinking that she was going to have this thing sewn up, that the Republicans are going to be fighting amongst themselves at this point, and yet the whole narrative is flipped. Now we've got the Democrats in a death struggle for the nomination, a lot of bitterness rising in and there's a good reason for that bitterness to rise because of the rigging of the system through the superdelegates. But I think it's very interesting to see what's happening with this. It's really going to damage her, I think, for the general election, don't you?
No, I do think so, and that's why they're trying so hard to control and co-opt Donald Trump, because there's a very real possibility. I mean, the polls are generally fudged anyway. We saw that in all the phony surges they ran in polling to try to defeat Romney for the nomination in 2012. So we really can't trust polling. But nevertheless, so I think, this is a very real possibility. They may be dealing with Donald Trump, and so they've got to co-opt him. That's why the meeting with Henry Kissinger and the multiple conversations. Paul Ryan is saying that he's about to resolve the conflict between he and Trump. His staff is denying that he's going to endorse him, but I think it's going to come pretty close to an endorsement.
How do you feel about that meeting between Kissinger? Because the one thing I heard Donald Trump say after that was he kind of joked, he goes, yeah, he meets with me and tells me how angry China is that we're not doing this. I mean, he almost kind of like, almost like a backhanded comment towards Kissinger. Like, yeah, I met with him, but he's putting pressure on me from the Chinese. He's acting like an ambassador from the Chinese is the way I read that comment.
Well, he always has been a representative of the Chinese. I mean, Kissinger has been accused because of his time in East Germany as a double agent, as being a communist, and he may have let the communists think that he was, but Kissinger is clearly a globalist.
Oh, yeah.
And so he's probably playing both sides. He clearly, is almost solely responsible for bringing China into the First Nation status that it is, both in terms as a member, not only of the UN, replacing Taiwan, but a member of the Security Council with veto power. And of course, the globalists want that for conflict creation. So he did represent China's view to Trump. He talked about how Trump is fearful, or China is fearful of a Trump victory. He did that kind of to play up to Trump. Trump is sadly very susceptible to flattery. And, Kissinger knows how to pour it on. I think Trump has some idea a little bit about what, Kissinger is about, but I'm not as convinced as Roger Stone is, for example, that Trump really understands the 9/11 conspiracy or the globalist conspiracy like he says he does.
Well, time will tell, won't it? I think I think his comments, the way I read his comments, I thought it was a pretty offhanded comment to Henry Kissinger. Certainly, he's going to need to meet with these individuals as they come to him. I mean, it's kind of like Don Corleone saying, I want to talk to you, but when he comes out, he goes, yeah, this guy is nothing but an agent of the Chinese. And I think we all understand that. We've seen that it was Kissinger who opened up had the great opening to China, but of course they have pushed China to take over our industry and our manufacturing. As people look at this, Joel, I mean, we see all these articles that are up on the Drudge Report today about all the different robot positions taking over jobs, taking over hamburger flipping, but also taking over farming, taking over white-collar jobs. But we understand that we have already eviscerated our economy by getting rid of our manufacturing. They kept telling us, hey, it's going to be great because we're going to have a service economy. And yet, as Gerald Celente has said, when you got a service economy, you're nothing but a servant. You are a butler or whatever. You're not going to get wealthy. You can't keep yourself free. You've lost the engine of wealth creation if you lose your manufacturing base. It isn't simply an idea that we're going to be able to buy our shoes and clothes at a cheaper price because we've got slave labor making it for us in China or in Vietnam. We're going to become dependent and passive. And to me, I look at these things that are coming down the pike with automobiles, and now they're selling us, after they've sold us a service economy, they're selling us a renter economy, where we don't own anything. They already talk about themselves being the stakeholders, us not owning anything. Now I think they're moving us to the point where not only are we servants in a service economy, but now we're going to be renters who don't own anything, including even our own cars.
And we mustn't forget the ultimate threat to national sovereignty in a war situation when you don't have steel manufacturing capability.
Yes.
When your chips for military equipment are manufactured overseas, how do you get it to your supply chain in a wartime economy? This is the real vulnerability which we're facing, because certainly Russia and China are building towards a war economy and building massive weapons of mass destruction as we disarm.
Let's talk about what's going on in Japan. This article from the Washington Post, outrage in Japan as U.S. Marine veteran is arrested in connection with the death of a woman on Okinawa. Your comments.
Well, this is a hot topic. As a former Marine pilot, I can tell you that Okinawa has been a hot topic ever since I was a pilot. Kadena Air Force Base, or not Air Force Base, but Marine Base there is a major operational base. We have nuclear, we're used